The first thing I ever knew about Alan Duffy was his scent. Glacier water and burnt cedar. Cold enough to sting the back of my throat the moment I stepped into that ballroom. I didn't know his name yet. I only knew that every Omega in the room had gone quiet, the way a forest goes quiet before snow. I am Jeremy Kane, and this is the story of how a man built entirely of frost let a single, terrifying, beautiful thing melt him down to nothing, and then rebuilt himself around me instead. My father called it an honor. I called it a sentence. The Duffy family doesn't make requests, Jeremy, he said, straightening his cufflinks like they mattered more than my future. They make decisions. You should be grateful they've decided on you. I wasn't grateful. I was 24 years old, an unbonded Omega with a business degree nobody in my family cared about. And I was being traded like inventory to secure a merger between two pack conglomerates that had been circling each other for a decade. Alan Duffy was the heir to all of it. The empire, the name, the ice that ran in his family's blood like a birthright. I'd seen pictures. Sharp jaw, sharper eyes, the kind of face that photographed like a warning label. People said he hadn't smiled since his mother died, that he ran his father's board meetings like executions, that 3 previous Omegas sent to court him had left in tears within a month. I told myself I would be the 4th. I told myself I didn't care. I was lying to myself before I'd even met him. The night of the courting ball, I wore navy because my scent consultant said it made my pheromones read as steady, not eager. I remember standing at the edge of the room watching alphas circle omegas like they were auditioning for parts in a play. None of us had agreed to be in, and then the doors at the far end opened, and the temperature of the entire room dropped. Alan Duffy did not walk into a room. He arrived in it the way weather arrives. He was taller than his photograph suggested, built lean and precise, like every inch of him had been engineered rather than grown. His hair was dark, cut close at the sides, and his eyes, I want to say they were blue, but blue is too warm a word. They were the color of ice over deep water, the kind you're not supposed to trust even when it looks solid. He crossed the room without looking at anyone. Conversations stopped as he passed. And then, 3 feet away from where I stood pretending not to watch him, he stopped walking. His nostrils flared, just barely. His jaw tightened. I felt it before I understood it. The way his scent reached toward mine like a hand testing a door. It didn't expect to be locked. For one breath, one single suspended heartbeat, something in his ice water eyes flickered. Then it was gone, shuttered so fast I almost convinced myself I'd imagined it. "You're the Kane Omega," he said. Not a question. His voice was low and even, sounded smooth of anything that might have given away a feeling. "Jeremy," I told him, because I refused to be a surname to him, even if I was one to my own father. He looked at me for a moment longer than necessary. "Jeremy," he repeated, like he was testing whether the word would crack in his mouth. Then he turned and walked to the drinks table, and that was the entire conversation. My first meeting with the man I would eventually marry lasted 40 seconds and ended with him ordering water with no ice, which I found darkly funny given everything I would come to learn about him. My cousin Marisol found me 20 minutes later, vibrating with secondhand scandal. "He talked to you?" "He hasn't talked to any of the others, not once, not even to reject them." I didn't tell her about the flicker in his eyes. I didn't have words for it yet. I just knew that something had reached for me in that ballroom, and something else had slammed the door on it immediately after, and I went home that night unable to stop replaying both. The courtship, if you could call it that, lasted 6 weeks. 6 weeks of scheduled dinners where Alan Duffy spoke perhaps 40 words per hour, of walks through his family's private gardens, where he kept exactly 3 feet between us at all times. Of formal letters from his assistant confirming plans that Alan himself never seemed inclined to make in person. I started keeping a mental list of the things he did instead of talking. He always pulled out my chair but never touched me while doing it. He noticed when I was cold before I did and would have a member of staff bring a blanket without ever offering his own jacket. He remembered that I took my tea with too much honey and no milk after I mentioned it exactly once, in passing, on our second dinner. He built me an entire architecture of care with materials that never once included warmth. Does he ever laugh? I asked his younger sister Delphine, the one member of the Duffy family who seemed to actually like me. She considered the question seriously, like I'd asked something scientific. He used to, before their mother. She didn't finish the sentence, and I didn't push. I learned, slowly, in fragments passed to me by staff and cousins and one very drunk uncle at a family function, what had made Alan Duffy into a man built of glass walls. His mother had been the pack's true alpha in every way that mattered. Warm where his father was calculating, fierce where his father was cruel. She had died when Alan was 16, in a car that his father's business rival had tampered with, and Alan had been the one to identify her body because his father was in a meeting he refused to leave. 16 years old, alone in a hospital corridor, learning that love could be assassinated as easily as anything else in his family's world. I understood the ice a little better after that. I still didn't know how to get past it. Our 6th week ended with the contract signing, a legal, bureaucratic thing done in a lawyer's office with our fathers beaming like they'd closed a satisfying business deal, which, of course, they had. Alan signed his name without reading a single line, which told me he trusted his lawyers completely or he simply didn't care what the document said as long as it accomplished what his father wanted. I couldn't tell which, and both possibilities made something in my chest ache. Afterward, in the elevator, just the two of us for the first time without an audience, he finally looked at me directly. "You don't have to pretend to be happy about this," he said. "I know what this is." "What is it?" I asked, my heart hammering harder than the question warranted. "A transaction," he said, and something in his voice, for just a moment, sounded almost apologetic. "I'll be a fair partner, I won't be a warm one. I think you should know that now, before the bonding, so you're not disappointed later." I wanted to tell him that I already was disappointed, that I'd been disappointed since the moment I felt him reach for me, and then watched him retreat that some traitorous, hopeful part of me had spent 6 weeks looking for the crack in his ice and finding only more ice underneath. Instead I said, "Thank you for the warning," and watched something in his face tighten like I'd struck a nerve he didn't expect me to find. The elevator doors opened. He walked out first. I stood there a moment longer, learning the shape of the loneliness I'd just agreed to marry. The bonding ceremony was smaller than the courting ball, more private, more real in a way that terrified me. It was just family, a pack elder to perform the rites, and the two of us standing in the Duffy family chapel while late afternoon light slanted gold through stained glass windows depicting alphas and omegas from 3 centuries of a lineage I was about to become part of. Ihan wore black. I wore the pale cream that omegas traditionally wore, and I remember my hands shaking so badly that Marisol had to help me with the final clasp of my collar. Not a literal collar, just ceremonial. A piece of jewelry marking the occasion, though the symbolism wasn't lost on me. When Alan took my hands, his were warmer than I expected. That surprised me more than anything else that day. The elder spoke the old words, the ones about scent and blood and the joining of 2 lines into one. And then came the part I'd been dreading and craving in equal measure, the moment where Alan would need to scent mark me mouth against the gland at my neck, marking me as bonded in a way no legal document could replicate. His hands came up to frame my jaw, careful, almost reverent in a way that contradicted every cold word he'd said to me in 6 weeks. He tilted my head to the side. I felt his breath against my throat, felt him inhale like he was trying to memorize something. "This part," he murmured, low enough that only I could hear, "isn't a transaction." Before I could ask what he meant, his mouth was against my throat and the bond snapped into place between us like a live wire. Heat and static and something deeper, something that felt like recognition. Like my body had been waiting its whole life for exactly this signature of scent and pulse and warmth to slot itself against my own. I gasped. I felt him go rigid against me, felt the same shock ripple through his own body, and understood in that single suspended second that whatever the bond was doing to me, it was doing to him too, and that terrified him more than it did me. He pulled back too fast. recovered his composure too quickly. By the time the elder pronounced us bonded, Alan Duffy's face was smooth ice again, like the last 10 seconds hadn't happened at all. But I'd felt it. I'd felt him feel it. And I held onto that thread all through the reception that followed, all through the polite applause and the toasts, and my father's insufferable pride. Because it was the first real proof I had that there was something under all that frost worth waiting for. That night, in the private wing of the Duffy estate, that was now apparently also my home, Alan knocked on the door between our adjoining rooms before he entered, which struck me as absurdly formal for a husband. But I said nothing. "The bond will want completing," he said, standing in the doorway like he might still change his mind about crossing the threshold. "I understand if you'd rather wait." I understood what he meant. An unconsummated bond could fade, given enough time and distance. An escape hatch some political marriages used to keep things technically legal but personally hollow. He was offering me the hollow version. He was giving me an out. "Do you want to wait?" I asked instead of answering. Something crossed his face, too fast to name, gone before I could be sure I'd seen it. "It doesn't matter what I want." "It matters to me," I said, and I meant it as more than politeness. I meant it as an invitation, a small crack of light I was trying to press him toward. "Alan, what do you want?" For a long moment, he didn't answer. Then he crossed the room slow, like he didn't quite trust his own legs, and knelt in front of where I sat on the edge of the bed, so that for once he had to look up at me instead of down. "I want," he said, voice rough in a way I'd never heard from him, "to not disappoint you. I don't know how to be what the others wanted. I don't know if I remember how." It wasn't romantic. It wasn't the confession I'd been hoping for. But it was honest. More honest than anything he'd said to me in 6 weeks, and I decided, right then, that honesty was a foundation I could build something on. "Then don't be what they wanted," I said, reaching for his hand where it rested on the bedspread. "Be whatever you actually are. I'll figure out how to want that." Quick pause here. If you want to watch our videos early with 0 ads or get access to exclusive videos, our Patreon has you covered. Link in the description. All right, back to where things get interesting. He looked at our joined hands like he'd never seen anything like it before. Then slowly, like a man unlearning a lifetime of restraint, one motion at a time, he leaned in and kissed me. Not the ceremonial mark against my throat, but my mouth. Gentle and searching and so careful it nearly broke my heart. What followed that night, I won't describe in the detail some parts of me want to. I'll say only this. For a few hours, Alan Duffy set down the armor he'd worn since he was 16 years old and let himself be touched like a person instead of a title. He was careful with me in a way that felt like apology and question and hope all tangled together. And when it was over, when we lay tangled in sheets gone soft with sweat and moonlight, he did something that undid me more than anything else that night. He fell asleep with his hand resting over my heart, like he needed proof it was still beating near his. I lay awake a long time after, memorizing the weight of that hand, terrified of how much I already wanted to keep it there. The months that followed our bonding were a strange, careful dance. Alan didn't become warm overnight. Ice doesn't melt because you found one crack in it, but I started to learn the shape of him underneath the frost, the way you learn a coastline by walking it slowly. Tide by tide, he worked constantly. The Duffy conglomerate ran shipping routes and manufacturing plants across 3 continents, and Alan carried the weight of it like it was a physical thing strapped to his shoulders, visible in the tightness around his eyes by the end of each day. I started leaving small things on his desk in the evenings, a cup of tea made exactly how he liked it, which I'd learned from watching him at breakfast, a blanket over his shoulders when he fell asleep at his desk, which happened more often than any spouse should allow. He never thanked me in words. But I noticed the teacups always came back to the kitchen empty, and I noticed the blanket was always folded precisely and placed back on the arm of the reading chair like he wanted me to know he'd used it deliberately rather than simply forgotten it there. Small mercies, small proofs. I collected them like a person gathering kindling, believing that eventually I'd have enough to build a real fire. there were harder days too. Days when his father, Desmond Duffy, would visit the estate, and something in Alan would shrink several sizes, the way a person does around an old wound that's never properly healed. Desmond had a way of speaking to his son that made my skin crawl. Not cruel, exactly. Never anything you could point to directly, just this constant undertone of disappointment. Like Alan had never once met some invisible standard his father held for him. "Your mother would be appalled at how soft you've gotten," Desmond said once, at a dinner I wasn't meant to overhear, apparently referring to some business decision Alan had made that prioritized worker safety over quarterly margins. I watched Alan's spine go rigid, watched him swallow whatever response wanted to come out, and something in me, something protective, something that had grown roots in me faster than I expected a bond to take, made me walk into that room and interrupt without an ounce of the diplomacy I'd been raised to have. "Actually," I said, setting down the tray I'd been pretending to carry as an excuse, "I think Alan's mother would be proud that the company still has a conscience. That's not softness, that's leadership that isn't afraid of the future." Desmond's eyes cut to me, cold and assessing, the family resemblance suddenly stark. "The Omega has opinions." "The Omega has a name," I said, "and yes, apparently, opinions." For one terrible second, I thought I'd overstepped in some way that would cost Alan dearly with his father. But then I glanced at Alan and found him watching me with an expression I'd never seen on his face before, something raw and startled and almost helplessly grateful. Like nobody had ever stood between him and his father's disappointment before. Desmond left shortly after, muttering something about needing to review the merger paperwork. The moment the door closed behind him, Alan crossed the room and pulled me into an embrace so sudden and fierce it knocked the breath out of me. "You didn't have to do that," he said into my hair, voice unsteady in a way I'd never heard. "I wanted to," I said, arms coming up around him slowly, savoring the fact that he'd initiated the contact for once, that he wasn't holding himself 3 careful feet away. "Someone should stand between you and that, Alan. Someone should have been doing it for years." He didn't answer, but he held on longer than the moment strictly required, and when he finally pulled back, his ice-water eyes were suspiciously bright, and he pressed a kiss to my forehead that felt like the most honest thing he'd done since the bonding ceremony. That night marked something shifting between us. Not fixed, not finished, but shifting the way a glacier shifts, imperceptibly slow, but undeniably in motion. I found out I was pregnant on an ordinary Thursday morning, 3 months into our marriage, in the small bathroom attached to my dressing room, staring at a test strip with hands that wouldn't stop trembling. Omega pregnancies weren't common this early into a bond. Most packs waited years before considering it, wanting to be sure the bond had settled properly first. But bonds like ours, the ones forged with genuine, unexpected chemistry underneath a political arrangement, sometimes moved faster than anyone planned for. My physician later told me it happened in maybe 1 bonding in 20. The body simply deciding the match was right before the mind had caught up to agreeing. I sat on the bathroom floor for a long time, test strip in hand, cycling through every possible reaction Alan might have. Relief, because an heir secured the merger further. Distance, because a child made everything more permanent, more real, more impossible to walk away from if the ice never fully melted. Or, and this was the fear that made my hands shake hardest, nothing at all. A cold acknowledgement. A transaction completed. I didn't tell him for 3 days. I told myself I was waiting for a doctor's confirmation, which was true, but it was also true that I was afraid, genuinely afraid, of watching his face show me exactly how much of a transaction I still was to him. On the 4th day, he found me in the garden, sitting very still on the stone bench near the roses his mother had apparently planted decades before. And something in my stillness must have alarmed him because he crossed the distance between us faster than I'd ever seen him move. "Jeremy, what's wrong?" I looked up at him. This man who wore ice-like armor, who I'd watched shrink under his father's words and swell with quiet fury defending workers he'd never met, who fell asleep with his hand over my heart like he needed the proof of it. And I decided I wasn't afraid anymore. Or rather, I was afraid, but I loved him too much by that point to let the fear win. "I'm pregnant," I said. The silence that followed lasted only a handful of seconds, but it felt like standing at the edge of a cliff, waiting to see which way the wind would push me. Then, Alan Duffy, Ice Prince of a conglomerate empire. A man who hadn't smiled since he was 16 years old sank down onto the stone bench beside me like his legs had simply stopped working and made a sound I'd never heard him make before. Something caught between a laugh and something far more fragile. He stopped. Started again. His hand found mine, gripping it like a lifeline. "We're having a baby." "We are," I said, watching him, cataloging every fracture in his composure like precious evidence. His eyes were wet. I'd never seen Alan Duffy cry. Not once. Not even at the mention of his mother. And here he was, crying in a rose garden because I'd told him he was going to be a father. "I'm scared," he admitted, voice cracking on the words like they cost him everything to say. "I don't know how to do this. I don't know how to be a father who isn't like mine. I don't know if I have it in me." I turned his hand over in mine, tracing the lines of his palm like I could read our future there. "You already do, Alan. You've been practicing for months. You just didn't know that's what you were doing." "What do you mean?" "Every time you left my teacup empty on purpose so I'd know you drank it. Every time you folded that blanket instead of leaving it crumpled. Every time you stood a little straighter after I stood up to your father. That's the practice, Alan. That's what care looks like when you're learning the shape of it for the first time." He pulled me against him then, careful of my middle in a way that made my chest ache with how quickly, how thoroughly, this man had rearranged his instincts around a life we hadn't even met yet. "I'm going to love this child so loudly," he whispered into my hair, "that they never once have to wonder if they're wanted." "And me?" I asked, before I could stop myself, needing to know, needing the words instead of just the actions I'd been collecting like kindling for months. He pulled back to look at me, ice water eyes gone soft as spring melt, and said the thing I'd been waiting 3 months, 6 weeks, and 1 bonding ceremony to hear. "I love you too, Jeremy. I think I have since the ballroom, since the second I caught your scent, and every instinct in me screamed that you were mine, before my brain had caught up enough to be terrified of that fact. I didn't know how to say it. I still don't know how to say it well. But I love you. I love you so much it frightens me." I cried then right there in his mother's rose garden, and he held me through it, and for the first time since I'd walked into that ballroom in navy blue, I let myself believe that the ice had actually, finally, truly begun to melt. Word spread through the Duffy household faster than either of us anticipated. Apparently, the head housekeeper had overheard enough of the garden conversation to spend the rest of the day in happy tears, and by dinner, half the staff knew, and by the following morning, so did Desmond Duffy. He arrived at the estate unannounced, which Alan told me was unusual even for him, and I braced myself for another round of the cold disappointment I'd witnessed at that earlier dinner. Instead, Desmond found us in the breakfast room, and something in his rigid posture faltered when his eyes landed on me. "Is it true?" he said without preamble. "Yes," Alan said, and I noticed he'd moved slightly, subtly, so that his body angled between me and his father. Not dramatically, not obviously, but there, a barrier that hadn't existed in any of their previous interactions I'd witnessed. Desmond's face did something complicated. For a moment I thought he might say something cutting, something about timing or business optics or the family's carefully managed public image. Instead, he sat down across from us, heavily, like the weight of decades had suddenly settled onto his shoulders. "Your mother," he said finally, "found out she was pregnant with you in the exact same rose garden. Did you know that?" Alan went very still. "No. She cried the way I imagined Jeremy cried yesterday when the housekeeper mentioned it to me this morning." Desmond's voice was strange, unpracticed at gentleness, like a language he'd forgotten he once spoke fluently. "I was harder then too, Alan. Harder than I am now, if you can believe that. She's the one who taught me how to soften. I lost that lesson somewhere after she died, and I let it curdle into something I passed on to you instead of the version she gave me." I watched Alan's jaw work. watched decades of hurt and longing cross his face in the space of a few seconds. You could have told me that any time in the last 8 years, Alan said, quiet, not accusing, just true. I know, Desmond said. I'm telling you now. For what it's worth, which I understand may not be much. I'm glad it's this one. His eyes flicked to me. I'm glad the ice found something worth melting for. It wasn't a full reconciliation. Some wounds take longer than one breakfast to heal, and I understood that Alan would carry the scars of his childhood for the rest of his life, the same way anyone carries the shape of the family that raised them. But it was a start. And opening a crack of light let into a room that had been sealed shut for a very long time, and I watched Alan's shoulders lower by a fraction. Watched something in him breathe a little easier for having heard it. After Desmond left, Alan found me in the library and kissed me slowly, thoroughly, like he was trying to pour something wordless into the contact. Thank you, he murmured against my mouth. For what? For making him remember how to talk to me? For making me remember there was a version of him worth forgiving eventually. He stopped, pressed his forehead to mine. For melting me, I suppose, since apparently that's the story everyone insists on telling about us. I laughed, and he smiled. An actual, full smile, the kind Delphine had told me he hadn't worn in 8 years. And something in my chest cracked open with a happiness so large it nearly hurt to hold. The months that followed were, in a word, transformative, for both of us, though in very different ways. My body changed first, the way pregnant bodies do. By 4 months, the slight roundness of my belly was impossible to hide under even my most generously cut clothes. And I remember the particular tenderness with which Alan would rest his hand there in the evenings, like he was checking that the miracle was still real. He read everything. I mean this literally. I would find him at 3 in the morning with stacks of books on omega pregnancy, on nutrition, on nesting instincts, on the specific hormonal needs of a bonded omega carrying his first child. Cross-referencing sources like he was preparing for an exam that mattered more than any board meeting he'd ever walked into. You don't have to memorize an entire library, I told him once, finding him asleep at his desk surrounded by open books, the same way I used to find him asleep surrounded by shipping manifests. I want to be prepared, he mumbled, only half awake, pulling me down into his lap with a strength that still surprised me given how gentle he'd become. I want to know everything you need before you have to ask for it. By 5 months, my nesting instincts kicked in hard, and Alan, Ice Prince terror of boardrooms, a man. 3 previous omegas had fled within weeks, spent an entire weekend on his hands and knees helping me rearrange the nursery furniture 17 times, until some deep, wordless part of me finally felt settled about the arrangement. He never once complained. He never once suggested I was being unreasonable. He simply moved the crib again and again and again, with the patience of a man who decided my comfort was worth infinite repetition. By 6 months, the staff had started referring to him affectionately as the different Mr. Duffy, a phrase that made him wince the first time he heard it and then, gradually, made him smile, like he was proud of having become someone different enough to earn a new name. The scent bond between us had deepened, too, the way I'd been told it would once a pregnancy took hold. I could tell his moods now from 3 rooms away, could feel the particular texture of his worry or his contentment threading through the air like weather patterns. He told me one night that he could feel the same from me, could sense the moment our child first quickened inside me before I'd even fully registered the flutter myself. A strange ripple of joy moving through the bond like sunlight breaking through clouds. Is it strange? I asked him, lying tangled together after a particularly intense wave of that shared feeling, that I can't imagine you cold anymore? I know you were. I watched it happen, that whole ballroom full of ice, but I can't picture it now. He was quiet for a moment, tracing slow circles against the curve of my belly, feeling for movement. I can, he said. I remember exactly how cold I was capable of being. I think about it sometimes, actually. How close I came to staying that way. If you'd been anyone else, if the bond hadn't hit the way it did in that chapel, I might have kept both of us at arm's length for years, the way I did those first 6 weeks. I might have raised our child the way my father raised me, all discipline and distance, mistaking coldness for strength. But you didn't. No. His hand stilled against my belly, feeling, I think, for the particular flutter that had become his favorite part of any given evening. You didn't let me. You kept standing there in front of me, patient and stubborn and warm, until the ice had nowhere left to hide. I used to think that was a weakness in me, letting you do that. Now I think it's the only strength I've ever actually had. The strength to let someone in when every instinct I was raised with told me not to. I didn't have words for how much that undid me, so I simply pulled him closer, and we lay there together in the dark, feeling our child move between us like a secret only the three of us shared. Not every chapter of this story was soft. I want to be honest about that because I think it matters. The story of us wasn't simply ice melting into warmth in one smooth, uninterrupted motion. There was a storm in the middle of it, and I nearly lost more than I ever admitted to Alan at the time. It happened at 7 months. A shipping route dispute had turned into something uglier than ordinary business rivalry. A rival pack conglomerate resentful of the Duffy-Kane merger's growing market share had apparently decided that the easiest way to destabilize Alan's position was to destabilize his family. I was at the estate, alone except for staff, when I began having contractions far too early, sharp and wrong in a way that sent ice, real ice, not the metaphorical kind, through my veins. Later, the physicians would determine it had been a targeted stress attack, a scent-based intimidation tactic delivered by an intruder posing as household staff, designed specifically to trigger early labor in a bonded omega through pure adrenal shock. It is, apparently, an old and vicious tactic in pack politics, one I hadn't known still existed outside of history books. I remember very little of the actual event with clarity. The pain, the fear, a member of staff screaming for the car. The drive to the hospital that felt like it lasted both no time at all and several lifetimes. What I remember with absolute aching clarity is Alan's face when he burst through the hospital doors, having driven himself the entire way after receiving the call mid-meeting, breaking every speed law in the process. He looked like a man who'd had the ground pulled out from beneath him. Ice water eyes wild, tie gone, hands shaking as he took mine in the hospital bed. "I'm here," he said, voice cracking on the words. "I'm here. I'm here. I'm so sorry I wasn't here." "You're here now," I managed, gripping his hand like the only solid thing left in a world gone unsteady. "Alan, the baby. They're going to stop it," he said, though I could hear the fear underneath his own certainty. "They're going to stabilize you both. I called every specialist this hospital has, and 3 more are on their way from the city. I don't care what it costs. I don't care about anything except—" He stopped, pressed his forehead to my hand. And then, for the first time since I'd known him, Alan Duffy prayed out loud in a hospital corridor to whatever gods might be listening, in a voice raw enough that I understood finally completely. The true scale of what he'd let himself become capable of feeling. "Please," he said, "please don't take them from me. Either of them. I have spent my whole life learning how not to need anyone, and I have spent the last year unlearning every part of that lesson because of him. And I cannot, I refuse, to go back to being a man who doesn't know how to need people. Not now, not after this. Please." The labor was managed ultimately with careful medical intervention that halted the early contractions and stabilized the pregnancy, though I was kept under close observation for the following week. And the doctors made clear that both mother and child had come closer to danger than any of us wanted to fully process. The person responsible for the attack was identified within days, a security breach traced back to the rival conglomerate, which resulted in a scandal so severe it effectively ended their standing in 3 markets simultaneously. I won't pretend Alan's response to that discovery was entirely gentle. The man who emerged from those days of legal and business retaliation was, briefly, every bit the ruthless force his reputation suggested he could be. But every ounce of that ruthlessness was aimed outward, in protection, never once turned toward me. What I remember most from that week isn't the fear, though the fear was real. What I remember is Alan refusing to leave my hospital room for longer than it took to shower, sleeping in a chair that couldn't have been comfortable for a man his height, reading to our unborn child every night in a low, steady voice because one of the specialists had mentioned that a familiar voice could help settle a stressed pregnancy. He read poetry, mostly. I hadn't known he liked poetry. I learned in that hospital room that his mother used to read it to him as a child, and that some small buried part of him had kept the habit alive in private for years, waiting apparently for someone worth sharing it with. By the time we were cleared to go home, something between us had been tempered rather than broken, the way metal grows stronger for having survived the forge. I understood, more deeply than I ever had, exactly how much Alan Duffy had let himself need me. And he understood, I think, exactly how much that need terrified and steadied him in equal measure. I used to think love was a liability, he told me one evening back home, his hand resting protectively over my belly as I dozed against his shoulder. Something that got you hurt, the way it hurt my father, the way it hurt 16-year-old me in that hospital corridor identifying my mother's body. I built the ice specifically to never feel that kind of loss again. And now I understand that the ice never protected me from anything, he said. It just delayed the moment I'd have to learn how to be brave. You taught me that bravery, Jeremy. Every day since that ballroom, you've been teaching me that. The final 2 months of my pregnancy passed in a strange, golden hush, the way I imagine the world goes quiet before a long-awaited storm. Except this storm was one we were desperately looking forward to. Alan cleared his schedule in ways his assistants told me had never happened in the company's history. No meetings after 4 in the afternoon, no international travel, entire days blocked off for what his calendar simply labeled family. A word I noticed his staff mentioned with something like wonder, as though watching a glacier learn to bloom. Delphine visited constantly, delighted beyond measure at the prospect of being an aunt, and even Desmond became a more frequent presence, his visits gentler now, marked by an effort at warmth that clearly cost him something to produce, but which he offered anyway, again and again, like a man determined to make up lost time before it ran out entirely. He asked me last week what color the nursery was, Alan told me one evening, sounding faintly stunned. My father! Asking about nursery colors. I don't think he's asked me a personal question since I was 12 years old. People can change, I said, resting my head against his shoulder, feeling our child shift restlessly beneath my ribs. You did. I had excellent motivation, he said, pressing a kiss to my temple, hand finding its familiar place against the curve of my belly. The single most stubborn, warm, relentless omega in existence, who apparently decided I was worth the effort of thawing. Worst decision I ever made, I teased, and he laughed. A full, easy sound that still, even after everything, felt like a gift every single time I heard it. At 8 months, we finished the nursery for the 18th and final time in a soft, warm yellow that Alan had chosen specifically because he said it reminded him of the way sunlight looked through the chapel windows on our bonding day. I hadn't known he'd been paying attention to the light that day. I'd assumed he'd been too locked in his own nerves to notice anything beyond the ceremony itself. It touched me more than I could say, learning that some quiet, careful part of him had been cataloging beauty the whole time, even when his face gave nothing away. We spent our evenings in that nursery, sometimes just sitting together in the rocking chair his mother had apparently used when he was an infant, a piece of furniture Desmond had produced unprompted from storage, restored and reupholstered without a word of explanation beyond she'd have wanted it used again. Alan would read to our unborn child in that chair most nights, poetry mostly, occasionally shipping reports which made me laugh until I nearly went into labor from the sheer absurdity of it. And I would watch him, this man who had once measured every interaction in careful, guarded distances, pour himself unguarded and entire into a chair built for exactly this kind of tenderness. I used to think I'd make a terrible father, he admitted one night, hands splayed wide over my belly, feeling for the answering kick that always came when he spoke. I thought the ice was inherited, unavoidable, the same way eye color is inherited. I thought I'd pass it down whether I wanted to or not. You won't, I said, with the absolute certainty of someone who'd watched him unlearn an entire lifetime of restraint over the past year. You've spent this whole pregnancy proving exactly the opposite, Alan. Look at what you've already given this child, and they haven't even been born yet. A father who reads to them every night. A father who rearranged furniture 17 times because it mattered to their other parents' comfort. Watts. A father who nearly broke apart from fear at the thought of losing them and rebuilt himself stronger for having survived it. He was quiet for a long moment, throat working like he was fighting down something too large for words. "Thank you," he finally said, "for seeing something in that ballroom worth waiting for. I don't know who I would have become without you. I don't think I want to know." Our son was born on a bright, cold morning in early winter, 3 weeks before his due date, but perfectly healthy, with a fierce set of lungs that Alan later swore with tears streaming unabashedly down his face. Sounded exactly like his own mother's laugh. The labor itself was long and difficult in the way these things often are, and I won't pretend it wasn't the hardest physical experience of my life. What I will say, with total clarity, is that Alan Duffy did not leave my side for a single second of it. He held my hand through every contraction hard enough to bruise his own fingers. He murmured a low, steady stream of encouragement and love against my temple that I only half remember through the haze of pain and adrenaline, though I remember enough of it, enough of the words "you're doing so well," and "I love you," and "almost there, almost there." "I've got you," repeated like a vow, to carry the memory of it for the rest of my life. When our son finally arrived, small and furious and perfect, the room went suddenly achingly quiet except for that first outraged cry, and I watched something in Alan Duffy break open completely. Not the sharp crack of ice fracturing, but something gentler, something like the first thaw of spring finally arriving after a winter that had lasted far, far too long. The nurse placed our son against my chest, and Alan leaned over both of us, one hand cradling our infant's impossibly small head, the other still gripping mine like he needed the physical proof that all three of us had made it through to the other side. "Look at him," Alan whispered, voice utterly wrecked, tears falling freely down a face that had once been famous throughout 3 continents for never showing anything at all. "Jeremy, look what we made." "He looks like you," I said, exhausted and radiant and more in love than I had words to express. "He's got your nose already. Poor thing." Alan laughed. That full, unguarded laugh I'd fought so hard to earn, and pressed his lips to our son's forehead, then to mine, then unexpectedly. Folded down onto his knees beside the hospital bed, like his legs had simply given out beneath the weight of everything he was feeling. "I used to think," he said, quiet now, just for the 3 of us, "that the version of me capable of feeling this much had died with my mother. I built an entire life on top of that grave, convinced there was nothing left underneath but ice, all the way down." He looked up at me, ice-water eyes gone warm and bright and utterly undone. "You proved me wrong. Every single day since that ballroom you proved me wrong, and now I have this." His hand trembled as it came to rest against our son's tiny back. "This entire impossible, perfect proof that I was capable of building something warm the whole time. I just needed you to teach me how." We named him Desmond Kane Duffy, a decision that made his grandfather weep openly in the hospital hallway when we told him the first tears I ever witnessed from that particular Duffy, and which seemed, in its own quiet way, to close a circle that had been broken for far too long. I'm writing this final chapter 3 years after that winter morning sitting in the nursery that eventually became a proper toddler's room, watching my husband chase our son around the garden his mother once tended, both of them laughing so loudly that Delphine's own 2 children visiting for the weekend have abandoned their game to join in. Alan Duffy is not, and never became, a soft man in the way the world typically imagines softness. He still runs his company with the same precision and rigor that made him a formidable presence in every boardroom he's ever entered. He still, on occasion, deploys a look so cold it's reduced grown business rivals to stammering apologies. The ice never disappeared entirely, and I've come to understand that it never should have. Some of that steel is simply part of who he is, forged by circumstance and honed by necessity. And I wouldn't want to erase every trace of the man who survived what he survived. But the ice no longer runs all the way down. That's the difference. That's the whole story really compressed into a single truth. Underneath the frost, there was always a man capable of extraordinary warmth, and it simply took someone patient enough, stubborn enough, and, I'll admit it, in love enough to wait for the thaw. He still reads to our son every night, poetry mostly, sometimes shipping reports when our son specifically requests them because apparently 3-year-olds find the cadence soothing regardless of content, a fact that never fails to make me laugh. He still remembers, unprompted, exactly how I take my tea. He still folds every blanket, precisely still notices when I'm cold before I do, still reaches for my hand in rooms full of people, the way he never once did in that first ballroom all those years ago, when 3 feet of careful distance felt like the safest place in the world for him to stand. Desmond, the elder one, my father-in-law, visits often now, and the two of them have built something across the wreckage of Alan's childhood that neither of them expected to find. Not a perfect relationship, never that, but an honest one, full of the kind of hard, deliberate effort that healing actually requires. My own father, for what it's worth, has never quite forgiven himself for treating my marriage as a transaction rather than a future, though I've told him more than once that I hold no resentment for it. How could I, when the transaction became the truest, warmest, most unlikely love story I could have ever imagined for myself? Some nights when our son is finally asleep and the house has gone quiet around us, Alan and I sit together in that same rose garden where I first told him about this whole impossible, beautiful chapter of our lives, and he still even now seems faintly amazed by his own capacity for joy. I keep waiting to wake up cold again, he admitted to me recently, his hand finding mine in the dark the way it always does now, instinctive, unguarded. Entirely unlike the man who once needed 3 careful feet of distance to feel safe. Some nights I still expect it, the ice creeping back in, reclaiming territory. Does it? I asked, though I already knew his answer. No, he said, bringing my hand to his lips, pressing a kiss against my knuckles with a tenderness that still, after everything, undoes me completely. It never does. You melted something in me that first night in the chapel, Jeremy, and it turns out that once ice becomes water, it doesn't remember how to freeze again. Not for you, not for our son, not for any of it. I think about that ballroom sometimes, the cold that radiated off him like a warning, the flicker in his ice water eyes that he shuddered so fast I nearly convinced myself I'd imagined it. I think about the girl I was then, 24, and terrified and furious at being handed a marriage instead of a choice, and I want, somehow, to reach back through time and tell her, wait. Stay. The ice is not the whole story. Underneath it, patient and afraid and starving for exactly the kind of warmth you carry, there is a man worth every ounce of the effort it will take to reach him. The Ice Prince Alpha did melt, in the end, the moment his Omega's belly grew round with a future neither of us had dared to imagine in that first frozen ballroom. But that's not quite the whole truth either. He didn't melt in a single moment. He melted slowly, deliberately, one small act of trust at a time, across a year of teacups returned empty and blankets folded with care and a hand that learned, finally, how to reach for mine without hesitation. That's the real story, I think. Not a prince transformed by a single miracle, but a man who chose, again and again, day after day, to let himself be loved. And in doing so, taught himself, at last, how to love in return. And if you ask him now in the quiet of our garden with our son's laughter drifting through the evening air and my hand held safe and warm in his, Alan Duffy will tell you, without a trace of the ice that once defined him, that it was the best decision he never technically got to make for himself, and the only transaction of his entire life that turned into something worth every single risk it took to complete. If you made it to the end, you're my kind of person. Leave a subscribe, comment down your favorite part of the story, and if you want early access to videos, exclusive content, or just want to support the channel, make sure to join our Patreon. Link is in the description. Even one member genuinely means the world to me. See you in the next one.